From these fragments, Margarita Nikolaevna managed to assemble something coherent. The two were whispering about how some deceased man, though they would not say who, had his head stolen from his coffin that morning. This was what had this Zeldibin character so worried. The men whispering on the trolley also appeared to have some connection to the deceased victim of robbery. "Will we have enough time to pick up flowers?" the little man fretted. "The cremation is at 2, you say." Finally, Margarita Nikolaevna had had enough of this mysterious gossip about the stolen head, and was glad to discover that her stop had been reached. Several minutes later, Margarita Nikolaevna was sitting on one of the benches beneath the Kremlin wall, in a spot that afforded her a view of the manège. Margarita squinted at the bright sun, recalling last night's dream, remembering how, exactly a year ago, to the day and hour, she had been sitting on this very bench next to him. Her black handbag lay beside her on the bench, just as it had then. He was not present today, but Margarita spoke to him in her thoughts all the same. "If you have been exiled, why won't you let me know? People do send word after all. Do you no longer love me?" "No. For some reason I cannot believe that." "Perhaps you died in exile. If so, I beg you to release me, to give me the freedom to live and breathe at last." Margarita Nikolaevna replied for him herself. "You are free. Am I keeping you?" And then she countered, "What kind of answer is that? No. Leave my memories, and then I will be free." People passed by Margarita Nikolaevna. A man glanced sidelong at the well-dressed woman, attracted by her beauty and solitude. He coughed and sat down at the end of Margarita's bench. Gathering courage, he spoke. "The weather's decidedly good today." But Margarita gave him such a grim look that he rose and walked away. "Here's a perfect example," Margarita said silently to him who possessed her. "Why did I chase that man away? I'm bored, and there's nothing truly bad about that Don Juan, except perhaps that silly word, decidedly. Why do I sit alone under this wall, like an owl? Why am I excluded from life?" She grew utterly sad and disheartened. But then, the same wave of anticipation and excitement that she had felt in the morning pushed her in the chest. Yes, something will happen. The wave pushed her again, and she realized that it was a wave of sound. Growing more distinct, the beat of approaching drums penetrated the city hum, accompanied by the slightly off-key sounds of brass instruments. A mounted policeman appeared first, riding by the garden fence, followed by 3 other policemen on foot. Then came a slow-moving truck bearing the musicians. Further, a brand-new open hearse, with a wreath-covered coffin upon it, and 4 people standing at the corners of its platform, 3 men and a woman. Even at a great distance, Margarita could see that the faces of the people accompanying the deceased on his final journey in the hearse bore odd expressions of confusion. This was particularly obvious with regard to the woman standing in the rear left corner of the platform. Her fat cheeks looked like they were being even further inflated by a juicy secret on the tip of her tongue. Mysterious little flames danced in her puffy eyes. It seemed that any moment now the woman would lose it, wink at the deceased and say, "Have you ever seen anything like this? It's practically supernatural." A crowd of mourners, some 300 strong, walked slowly behind the hearse, with equally confused looks. Margarita followed the procession with her eyes, and listened to the dreary sounds of the Turkish drum, fading in the distance with the same repetitive boom, boom, boom. What a strange funeral, she thought, and how depressing all those booms. Oh, I would truly sell my soul to the devil to find out if he is alive or not. It would be interesting to know, though, who it is they are burying with such odd faces. Berlioz, Mikhail Alexandrovich, came a slightly nasal voice from nearby, the chairman of Masolit. Surprised, Margarita Nikolaevna turned and saw a gentleman who had apparently managed to slip quietly onto the bench while Margarita had been distracted by the procession. Evidently she had absent-mindedly asked her last question out loud. Meanwhile, the procession slowed down, probably delayed by a traffic light. "Yes," the unknown man continued. "Funny mood they're in, ferrying a dead man, and all they can think about is where his head went." "What head?" Margarita asked, peering at her unexpected neighbour. He turned out to be a short man with flaming red hair and a fang. He wore a starched shirt, a quality-striped suit, patent leather shoes, and a bowler. He had a flashy tie. His breast pocket was of particular interest. Where men usually keep a handkerchief or a pen, this particular gentleman had a bare chicken bone sticking out. "Well, you see," the redhead explained, "this morning someone stole the head of the deceased right out of the coffin in the Griboyedov Hall." "How can that be?" Margarita asked reflexively, even as she recalled the whispers on the trolley. "Hell knows how," the redhead replied insolently. "Though I suspect it wouldn't hurt to ask Behemoth. Awfully clean theft. Monstrous scandal. And most importantly, no one can figure out what anyone could want with this head." Though deep in her own thoughts, Margarita Nikolaevna was none the less amazed by the stranger's bizarre lies. "Hold on," she exclaimed suddenly. "Which Berlioz? Is this what the papers today?" "But of course, of course." "So then these must be writers following the coffin?" Margarita asked, baring her teeth suddenly. "Well, naturally." "And would you recognise them by their faces?" "Every single one," the redhead replied. "Tell me," said Margarita, and her voice turned hollow. "Is there a critic by the name of Latunsky among them?" "How can there not be?" the redhead replied. "There he is, in the 4th row on the edge." "The blonde one?" Margarita asked, squinting. "Ash-coloured hair. See how he raises his eyes to the heavens? Looks like a priest." "Bingo." Margarita had no further questions, and peered at Latunsky. "I see you really hate this Latunsky," said the redhead, smiling. "I hate a few others too," Margarita said through her teeth. "But it's not that interesting a subject." Meanwhile, the procession began to move on, a chain of mostly empty cars following those on foot. "Indeed, nothing interesting about it, Margarita Nikolaevna." "You know me?" Margarita asked, surprised. Instead of answering, the red-headed man removed his bowler and held it to the side. "A real bandit's face," thought Margarita, studying her random visitor. "Well, I don't know you," she said dryly. "How could you? Anyhow, I've been sent to discuss a certain matter with you." Margarita grew pale and drew back. "That's what you should have started with," she spoke. "No need to spew hell knows what about a severed head. You are here to arrest me?" "Nothing of the sort," the redhead exclaimed. "What's this? If I am talking to you, I must be here to arrest you? I simply have some business to discuss with you." "I don't understand. What business?" The red-headed man glanced round and said mysteriously, "I was sent to give you an invitation for tonight." "What are you rambling about? What invitation?" "From a very wealthy foreigner," the redhead said meaningfully, narrowing his eyes. Margarita became incensed. "Now here's something new. A street pimp," she said, rising to leave. "Some errand this is. Thanks for nothing," exclaimed the redhead, offended, and growled after Margarita, "Dunce!" "Bastard!" she replied, turning her head, and immediately heard the voice of the red-headed man behind her. "Darkness descending from the Mediterranean Sea engulfed the city so hated by the procurator. Gone were the suspended bridges connecting the temple to the fearsome Antonia Tower. Gone was Yerushalayim, the great city, gone as though it had never existed. And you can get lost as well with your charred notebook and your dried-up rose. Keep sitting here alone on the bench, begging him to grant you freedom, to let you breathe, to leave your memory. Turning white, Margarita returned to the bench. The red-headed man stared at her through the slits of his eyes. "I don't understand," Margarita Nikolaevna said quietly. "It's possible to find out about the notebook, to infiltrate, to spy. Has Natasha been bought? Is that it? But how could you know my thoughts?" She frowned miserably and added, "Tell me who you are. Which bureau are you from?" "What a bore," grumbled the redhead, and then spoke louder. "Forgive me, but I've already told you I am not from any bureau. Sit down, please." Margarita obeyed unquestioningly, but as she sat down, she could not help asking again, "Who are you?" "Oh, all right. My name is Azazello, not that it will tell you anything." "Will you tell me how you found out about the manuscript and my thoughts?" "I will not," Azazello replied dryly. "But do you know anything about him?" Margarita whispered imploringly. "Well, let's say I do." "I beg you, just tell me if he's alive. Don't torture me." "Well, all right. He's alive, Azazello replied reluctantly. "Oh, God!" "Please, no fussing or screaming," Azazello said, frowning. Forgive me, muttered a newly obedient Margarita. "I was angry with you, of course, but you must agree, when someone on the street invites a woman to visit someone— I have no prejudices, I assure you." Margarita smirked uneasily. "But I never see any foreigners. I have no desire to interact with them, and besides, my husband— the drama of my life is that I live with a man I don't love, but I consider ruining his life unworthy. I've had nothing from him but kindness." Azazello took in the incoherent speech with noticeable boredom and said sternly, "I'll ask you to be quiet for a moment." Margarita humbly fell silent. "The foreigner I'm inviting you to visit is completely harmless, and not a soul will know of your visit. That much I can vouch for." "What does he want with me?" Margarita asked insinuatingly. "You will find out later." "I see. I am to give myself to him," Margarita said pensively. Azazello smirked contemptuously at this and answered, "Any woman in the world would dream of it, I assure you." Azazello's mouth twisted in a sneer. "But I must disappoint you. It will not happen." "What sort of foreigner is this?" Margarita exclaimed in utter confusion, so loudly that the passers-by turned to look at her. "And why should I be interested in seeing him?" Azazello leaned towards her and whispered meaningfully, "Well, there's a lot in it for you. You'll seize the opportunity." "What?" Margarita exclaimed, and her eyes widened. "If I understand you correctly, you are hinting that I could find out what happened to him." Azazello nodded silently. "Let's go," Margarita exclaimed forcefully, grabbing Azazello by the arm. "Anywhere you say." Azazello heaved a sigh of relief and leaned back on the bench, his back obscuring the large letters of the name Niura that had been carved into the wood. "Tough crowd, these women." He stuck his hands in his pockets and stretched out his legs far in front of him. "Why did they send me, for instance? Behemoth should have gone. He's got charm." Margarita spoke, a crooked, wretched smile on her face. "Would you stop mystifying and tormenting me with your riddles? I am a miserable person after all, and you are taking advantage of it. Here I am, about to get into some questionable escapade, but I swear only because you have enticed me with news of him. My head is spinning from all these conundrums." "Spare me the drama," Azazello replied, grimacing. "Consider my situation as well.
beat up some manager, or kick someone's uncle out of his apartment, or shoot somebody, or some other trifle like that, that's right in my field. But talking to a woman in love? My humble thanks, but no thanks. I've been trying to coax you into this for a good half-hour now. So are you coming, or not?"
"I am," Margarita Nikolaevna replied simply.
"In that case, please be so kind as to accept this,"
Azazello said. Extracting a small, round, gold box from his pocket, he handed it to Margarita with the words,
"Hide it already, people are looking." "You could use it, Margarita Nikolaevna. You've aged quite a bit in the past few months from all your grief."
Margarita flushed but said nothing while Azazello continued.
"Tonight, at exactly 9:30, kindly strip naked and rub this ointment all over your face and your body. Afterwards, do what you want, but stay by the telephone. At 10, I will call you and tell you all you need to know. You needn't worry about a thing. You'll be delivered where you need to go, without any hassle. Understood?"
Margarita was silent for a moment, and then said, "Understood. This box is solid gold. I can tell by its weight. Very well, then. I see I am being bribed and drawn into some shady business which I will dearly regret."
"What's this now?"
Azazello all but hissed. "Again? No, hold on."
"Give back the cream."
Margarita gripped the box tighter in her hand and continued, "No, hold on. I know what I'm getting into, but I'm doing it all for him, for I have no other hope in the world. But I want to tell you that if you should lead me to my demise, you'll be ashamed. Yes, ashamed. I will have perished for love." And striking herself on the chest, Margarita glanced at the sun.
"Give it back,"
Azazello hissed angrily.
"Give it back. To hell with this. Let Behemoth do this."
"Oh no!" Margarita exclaimed, to the amazement of nearby pedestrians. "I agree to everything. Agree to perform this entire farce with the ointment. Agree to go to the depths of hell if need be. I won't give it back." "Bah!" Azazello shrieked suddenly, popping his eyes out of the garden fence, and began pointing at something with his finger. Margarita turned to look where Azazello was pointing, but saw nothing of interest. Then she turned back to Azazello, wishing to receive an explanation for this odd "bah," but there was no one around to give it. Margarita Nikolaevna's mysterious visitor had vanished. Margarita quickly checked her handbag, where she had previously hidden the little box, and made sure it was still there. Then, without pausing to think, she hurried away from the Alexandrovsky Gardens. Chapter 20. Azazello's Cream. A full moon hung in the clear evening sky, peeping through the maple branches. The lindens and acacias in the garden painted a complex pattern of shadows on the ground. Open, but with blinds drawn, the triple bay window upstairs radiated feverish electric light. All the lamps were on in Margarita Nikolaevna's bedroom, and they cast light on an utter mess. Shirts, stockings, and underwear lay on the bedspread. More crumpled clothing lay on the floor next to a packet of cigarettes crushed in the excitement. Shoes lay on the bedside table next to an unfinished cup of coffee and an ashtray with a smoking butt. A black evening dress was draped over the back of a chair. The room smelled of perfume, mixed in with the smell of a hot iron that was drifting in from somewhere. Margarita Nikolaevna was sitting by the dressing-table, wearing only her bathrobe and black suede shoes. A gold wristwatch bracelet lay in front of her next to the box she had received from Azazello, and Margarita's eyes were glued to the watch face. At times it would seem that the watch was broken and the hands were not moving, but move they did, though very slowly, as if stuck, until finally the minute hand fell upon 9:29. Margarita's heart gave a thump so hideous that she was not able to pick up the box right away. Wrestling with herself, she opened it and found a thick, yellowish cream inside. It reeked of something resembling swamp mud. Using her fingertip, Margarita spread out a bit of cream on her palm, causing the smell of forest and swamp grasses to intensify, and began to rub it into her forehead and cheeks. The cream spread easily and seemed to evaporate instantly. After several applications, Margarita glanced at the mirror and dropped the box straight on the watch, sending numerous cracks running across the glass face. Margarita closed her eyes, then looked again, and burst out in boisterous laughter. Her eyebrows, plucked down to a thread with tweezers, had thickened and formed into two neat arcs over her greening eyes. The thin vertical wrinkle on the bridge of her nose, which appeared back in October when the Master vanished, was gone without a trace. Gone were the yellow blemishes by her temples as well, and so were the two barely noticeable webs of wrinkles on the outside corners of her eyes. Her cheeks filled with a solid rosy colour, her forehead became clear and white, and the hairdresser's curls in her hair came undone. A naturally curly brunette of about 20 years of age was gazing at the 30-year-old Margarita from the mirror, baring her teeth and laughing uncontrollably. Having laughed her fill, Margarita leapt out of her bathrobe in a single bound, scooped up a large portion of the light oily cream, and began to rub it vigorously into her body. Her skin immediately took on a rosy colour and pleasant glow. Then, as if someone had pulled a needle out of her head, the pain that lingered in her temple since the meeting in the Alexandrovsky Gardens vanished. Her arm and leg muscles grew stronger, and then Margarita's body became weightless. She jumped and floated in the air a short distance above the carpet. Slowly, she was pulled back down and landed on the floor. "What a cream! What a cream!" Margarita cried, falling into an armchair. The cream altered more than her appearance. Her entire being was now simmering with bubbles of joy that tickled every part of her body. Margarita felt free of everything. Moreover, it was now clear to her that her morning premonition had been true, and that she was to leave the mansion and her old life behind forever. However, a single thought did splinter off from this former life, reminding her of a single, final duty to be performed before something entirely new and extraordinary pulled her up and away into the air. And still naked, taking short flights through the air, she ran to her husband's study, turned on the light, and dashed to the desk. She tore a sheet from a notepad, and without any revisions, quickly penciled a note in large letters. "Forgive me and forget as soon as possible. I am leaving you forever. Do not look for me. It will be useless. My grief and woe have turned me into a witch. I have to go. Farewell. Margarita." Her soul completely unburdened, Margarita flew back to the bedroom. A second later, Natasha ran in, loaded with things. And all these things, a dress on a wooden hanger, lace handkerchiefs, silken blue shoes on shoe trees, and a belt, came crashing down to the floor immediately, as Natasha clasped her freed hands. "Not bad, huh?" Margarita Nikolaevna shouted loudly and hoarsely. "What's all this?" Natasha whispered, backing up. "How did you do it, Margarita Nikolaevna?" "It's the cream! The cream! The cream!" Margarita replied, pointing to the shiny golden box and turning in front of the mirror. Forgetting the crumpled dress on the floor, Natasha ran to the dressing table and stared at the remaining ointment with greedy fire in her eyes. Her lips were whispering something inaudible. She turned back to Margarita and spoke reverently. The skin, Margarita Nikolaevna, your skin is glowing." Then she remembered herself, ran to pick up the dress, and began to dust it off. Leave it, Margarita cried. "To hell with it, leave it all. On second thought, no. Take it as a gift. Take it, I tell you. Take all there is in the room." Beside herself, the motionless Natasha stared at Margarita for a few moments, then latched onto her neck, kissing her and yelling, "Satin! Glowing satin! And the eyebrows! The eyebrows!" "Take all the rags, take the perfume, and put it in your suitcase. Hide it," Margarita shouted. "But leave the jewellery, or they'll accuse you of theft." Natasha gathered whatever she found in a bundle, dresses, shoes, hose, and underwear, and ran from the bedroom. At the same time, a thunderous virtuoso waltz burst from an open window somewhere across the street, and the sputtering of an approaching car engine came from the gate. "Azazello is about to call," Margarita exclaimed, listening to the waltz pouring out of the alley. "He will call, and the foreigner is harmless. I can see now that he is harmless." The car revved its engine as it pulled away from the gate banged, and footsteps came from the tiles of the path. "That would be Nikolai Ivanovich. I recognize his footsteps," Margarita thought. "I'll need to pull off something interesting and hilarious before I go." Margarita tore the blinds aside and sat sideways on the windowsill, grasping one knee with her hands. The moonlight licked her right side. Margarita raised her head to the moon and put on a pensive, poetic face. The footsteps sounded once more and suddenly stopped. After admiring the moon for a little longer, Margarita sighed decorously and turned her head towards the garden. Indeed, she saw Nikolai Ivanovich, who lived on the bottom floor of the house. Bright moonlight was pouring over him. He was sitting on a bench, and it was clear that he had collapsed onto it a second ago. He was clutching his briefcase, and the pince-nez on his face was tilted. "Why, hello there, Nikolai Ivanovich," Margarita spoke in a sad voice. "Good evening. Coming back from a meeting?" Nikolai Ivanovich did not answer. "As for me," Margarita continued, leaning further out into the garden, "I am sitting here alone and bored, as you can see, staring at the moon, listening to the waltz." Margarita passed her left hand over her temple, adjusting a lock of hair, then spoke irritably. "You're being rude, Nikolai Ivanovich. I am a lady, after all. It's just rude to ignore someone who is talking to you." The moon lit up Nikolai Ivanovich to the last button on his grey shirt, to the last hair in his blonde goatee. All of a sudden, he grinned wildly and rose from the bench. Evidently forgetting himself in embarrassment, he waved his briefcase instead of taking off his hat, and bent his knees as if to break into dance. "What a boring character you are, Nikolai Ivanovich," Margarita continued. "In fact, I am so sick of you that I could not possibly express it, and I am so happy to be parting with you. Go to hell." Just then, the phone burst out ringing behind her back in the bedroom. Margarita leaped off the windowsill and snatched the receiver, forgetting all about Nikolai Ivanovich.
"Mrs. Azazello?"
said a voice in the receiver. "Dear, dear Azazello!" Margarita exclaimed.
"It is time. Fly on out,"
Azazello said in the receiver, and one could easily tell from his tone how pleased he was with Margarita's sincere, joyful impulse.
"As you fly over the gate, shout, 'Invisible!' Fly around the city a little to get some practice, and then head south, away from the city, straight to the river. They are waiting for you."
Margarita hung up, and suddenly an odd, wooden sort of hobbling came from the neighbouring room, and something knocked on the door. Margarita flung it open, and a broom flew dancing into the bedroom, bristles upward. It drummed on the floor with its other end, kicking and straining towards the window. Margarita screamed with delight and jumped onto the broom. Only then did the rider realise that she had forgotten to get dressed in all the confusion. She galloped to the bed and snatched the first thing she could find, a light blue shirt. Waving it like a banner, she flew out of the window. The waltz over the garden struck up louder. Margarita slid downwards from the window and saw Nikolai Ivanovich. Frozen on the bench, completely dumbfounded, he was listening to the screaming and the crashing coming from the lit bedroom of the tenants above. "Farewell, Nikolai Ivanovitch!" Margarita shouted, cavorting in front of him. He gasped and began sliding across the bench, running his hands over it and knocking over his briefcase in the process. "Farewell forever! I am flying away!" Margarita shouted over the waltz. Then she realised that she would not need her shirt at all, and laughing sinisterly, draped it over Nikolai Ivanovitch's head. The blinded Nikolai Ivanovitch came crashing down onto the bricks of the path. Margarita turned to take a final look at the mansion where she had suffered for so long, and saw Natasha's face in the burning light, twisted with amazement. "Farewell, Natasha!" Margarita cried, and reared up the broom. "Invisible! Invisible!" she yelled louder still. The branches of the maple lashed at her face as she flew between them, over the gate and out onto the street, chased by the utterly insane sounds of the waltz. Chapter 21. The Flight. Invisible and free! Invisible and free! Flying over her lane, Margarita turned into a perpendicular street. In a fraction of a second, she sliced through the long, patched-up, crooked old alley, its centrepiece the slanted door of a paraffin shop, where they sold fuel by the cup, as well as bottles of parasite repellent. It immediately dawned on her that, free and invisible though she was, the pleasure required a degree of prudence. Miraculously, she managed to brake in time to avoid dashing herself to death against an old crooked street-light on some corner. Dodging it, Margarita clasped her broom tighter and slowed down, looking out for electrical lines and signs hanging over the pavement. The third alley led directly to the Arbat. By this point, Margarita was fully at ease with the broom, realising that the latter obeyed the slightest motion of her arms and legs, and that flying over the city required one to be very attentive and avoid violent movements. It also became quite clear that the pedestrians on the street could not see the flyer. There were no raised heads, no cries of "Look, look!" No one dashed from her path or screamed or fainted or laughed insanely. Margarita flew noiselessly, very slowly and close to the ground, at roughly the second-floor level. Even at such low speeds, however, she managed to lose control for a second. Just as she was entering the blindingly lit Arbat, her shoulder hit a bright disc with an arrow on it. This angered Margarita. She reined in her obedient broom, flew off to the side, and then launched herself suddenly at the disc, smashing it to smithereens with the tip of the broom. The pieces came crashing down, the people below jumped away, and a whistle came from somewhere, while Margarita, having done this unnecessary deed, burst out laughing. "I'll need to be more careful on the Arbat," she thought. "Everything is so tangled up here that it's impossible to sort it out." She began weaving between the electrical lines. Roofs of buses, cars and trolleys floated beneath her, while the pavements channelled what appeared to Margarita to be rivers of caps. Little streams branched off from the rivers and poured into the fiery mouths of nighttime shops. "What a mess," Margarita thought irritably. "It's impossible to even turn properly around here." She crossed the Arbat and rose higher, to the fourth-floor level, floating past the dazzlingly lit tubes on the corner theatre and into a side street with several tall buildings. All the windows were open, and music came from radios everywhere. Out of curiosity, Margarita peeped into one. She saw a kitchen. 2 primuses were roaring on the stove, and 2 women were standing by them, holding spoons and squabbling. "You have to turn off the bathroom light after you use it, Pelagia Petrovna," spoke one woman as she stood in front of a steaming pot with some manner of foodstuff inside, "or else we'll have you evicted." "Look who's talking, you're full of it," replied the other. "You're both full of it," Margarita said loudly, clambering over the windowsill into the kitchen. The quarrellers turned towards the voice and froze, the dirty spoons still in their hands. Margarita reached carefully between them and closed the valves on both primuses, extinguishing them. The women gasped, and their jaws dropped. But Margarita had already grown bored and flew back out onto the street. Her attention was drawn to the luxurious bulk of an apparently brand-new 8-story building at the end of the street. Margarita descended, and upon landing saw that the front of the building was finished in black marble, that a doorman's jacket buttons and gold-trimmed service cap were glittering beyond the broad glass doors, and that above them a golden inscription read, "Dramlit House." Margarita squinted at the inscription, racking her head as to what Dramlit could mean. Tucking the broom under her arm, she entered the foyer, bumping the surprised doorman with the door, and saw an enormous black board on the wall next to the elevator. The tenants' names and apartment numbers were inscribed on it in white letters. The words, "Residence for Dramatists and Literary Workers," above the list caused Margarita to let out a savage, choked howl. Rising in the air, she read the names hungrily. Hustov, Dvubratsky, Quant, Beskudnikov, Latunsky. "Latunsky!" Margarita screamed. "Latunsky! It's him! He ruined the Master!" By the entrance, the doorman was practically jumping with amazement, his eyes bulging out as he gazed at the black board and tried to comprehend the miracle, why the list of tenants was screaming. As for Margarita, she was already hurrying upstairs, repeating to herself in rapture, "Latunsky, 84, Latunsky, 84. 82 to the left, 83 to the right, a little higher, and to the left, 84. Here's the sign. O. Latunsky." Margarita hopped off her broom, and the stone floor felt pleasantly cool on the overheated soles of her feet. Margarita rang once, rang again. No one answered. Margarita pressed the button harder, and could hear the ringing fill Latunsky's apartment. Yes, to the end of his days must the inhabitant of apartment number 84 on the 8th floor be grateful that the chairman of Masolit had been run over by a tram, and that the memorial meeting had been scheduled for that evening. The critic Latunsky had truly been born under a lucky star. It saved him from an encounter with Margarita, who turned into a witch that Friday. No one answered. Then Margarita flew downstairs at full speed, counting off the floors, reached the bottom, and burst out onto the street. Looking up, she inspected and counted the windows outside, determining which belonged to Latunsky's apartment. Undoubtedly, they were the 5 darkened windows at the corner of the building on the 8th floor. Convinced, Margarita rose in the air, and several seconds later entered the unlit apartment through an open window. Only a narrow beam of silver moonlight provided illumination. Margarita ran along it and felt for the light switch. Soon the entire place was lit. Her broom stood in a corner. After making sure no one was home, Margarita opened the door and checked the sign. It was the right one. Margarita was where she needed to be. They say that, to this very day, the critic Latunsky grows pale when he recalls that terrible night, and speaks reverently of the late Berlioz. Who knows what dark and vile criminal act could have marked the evening? Margarita returned from the kitchen with a heavy hammer in her hands. Naked and invisible, the flying woman tried to restrain and reason with herself, but her hands were shaking with anticipation. Taking careful aim, Margarita struck the keys of the piano, and a pitiful wail filled the apartment. Innocent of any crime, the Becker instrument cried out in frenzied agony. Its keys fell in, the ivory plating flying in all directions. The instrument buzzed, howled, gasped, and rang. With the sound of a pistol shot, the polished upper sounding board split from a hammer blow. Breathing heavily, Margarita twisted and tore the strings with the hammer. At last, tired, she broke off and slumped into an armchair to catch her breath. The menacing sound of rushing water came from the bathroom and the kitchen. "Sounds like it's hit the floor," Margarita thought, and added aloud, "Anyway, no time to lounge around." A stream was already running from the kitchen into the hall. Splashing her bare feet in the water, Margarita brought buckets of it from the kitchen to the critic's study and poured them into the desk drawers. After breaking the cabinet doors in the same study, she dashed to the bedroom. Smashing the mirrored wardrobe, she pulled out the critic's suit and drowned it in the bathtub. The contents of a full inkwell, taken from the office, ended up in the lavishly fluffed double bed in the bedroom. The destruction she unleashed gave her burning pleasure. But at the same time, she found the end result to be rather unimpressive. Therefore, she started going at anything she found. She smashed the ficus pots in the room with the piano. Leaving the job unfinished, she returned to the bedroom and slashed the sheets with a kitchen knife, then smashed the framed photographs. She felt no fatigue, and only sweat poured off her in torrents. Meanwhile, in apartment number 82, directly below Latunsky, the dramatist Quant's housekeeper was drinking tea in the kitchen, wondering at all the rumbling, running and ringing coming from above. Raising her head towards the ceiling, she suddenly saw its white colour change into a deathly shade of blue. The stain grew wider before her eyes, and droplets of water swelled up on it. The housekeeper sat marvelling at this oddity for a full 2 minutes, until finally water began to rain from the ceiling and drum on the floor. Then she jumped up and placed a basin under the stream, which did not help in the least, for the raining area expanded and began to pour onto the gas stove and the table with dishes on it. Shrieking, Quant's housekeeper ran out onto the staircase, and Latunsky's apartment immediately filled with ringing. "That would be my cue to start packing," said Margarita. She sat on her broom, listening to the female voice shouting into the keyhole. "Open up! Open up! Dusia, open up! Is your water leaking or something? We're flooded!" Margarita rose a few feet in the air and struck the chandelier. 2 light bulbs exploded, and crystal pendants flew in all directions. The shouting in the keyhole stopped, and hurried footsteps came from the staircase. Margarita drifted through the window, and once outside, took a light swing and struck the window pane with the hammer. There was a snivelling sound, and a cascade of shards ran down the building's black marble. Margarita rode over to the next window. Far below, people began scurrying around on the sidewalk. One of the 2 cars standing by the front entrance honked and drove off. Finishing off Latunsky's windows, Margarita moved on to the neighbouring apartment. The blows grew more frequent. The entire street filled with ringing and crashing. The doorman ran outside, looked up, hesitated a moment, clearly unsure of how to act, then placed his whistle in his mouth and began to whistle furiously. To the sounds of the whistle, Margarita put out the last window on the 8th floor with particular gusto, then descended to the 7th and began to smash windows there. Tormented by long hours of idleness by the mirrored doors, the doorman poured his entire soul into his whistling. What's more, he followed Margarita around the building, as if providing musical accompaniment. He gathered air into his lungs during the pauses when Margarita flew from window to window, then puffed out his cheeks and broke into whistling at her every stroke, piercing the night air all the way to the sky. His efforts, combined with the infuriated Margarita's own, produced significant results. Panic spread throughout the building. Those windows that were still whole would open, and people's heads would appear only to hide again. Open windows, by contrast, would close. Dark silhouettes appeared in the bright windows of adjoining buildings as people tried to understand why the new dram-lit house window panes were bursting of their own accord. Outside, people were running towards Dramlit House, while inside its residents stampeded up and down every staircase without any rhyme or reason. Quant's housekeeper kept shouting to everyone that she had been flooded, and was soon joined by Hustof's housekeeper from apartment number 80, located below Quant's. Water poured from the ceiling in Hustof's kitchen and bathroom. Finally, an enormous slab of plaster fell from the ceiling in Quant's kitchen, smashing all the dirty dishes and unleashing a veritable downpour. Bucketfuls of water surged from the wet, drooping squares of lath. Screams came from the main staircase. Passing by the second-last window on the 4th floor, Margarita glanced inside and saw a man who, in a fit of panic, had pulled a gas mask over his head. Striking his window pane with the hammer, Margarita frightened him, and he disappeared from the room. Then, suddenly, the savage destruction ceased. Slipping down to the 3rd floor, Margarita looked into the corner window, covered by a thin, dark blind. Inside, a weak light burned under a shade. A boy of about 4 years of age was sitting on a small bed with netted sides and listening in fear. There were no adults in the room. Evidently, they had all run out of the apartment. "Windows are breaking," the boy said, and called out, "Mummy!" No one answered, and then he said, "Mummy, I'm afraid." Margarita opened the curtain and flew in the window. "I'm afraid," repeated the boy, starting to tremble. "Don't be afraid, little one," Margarita said, trying to soften her criminal voice made hoarse by the wind. "That was just some boys breaking the windows." "With catapults?" the boy asked and stopped shaking. "Yes, catapults," Margarita confirmed. "Now go to sleep." "It's Sitnik," said the boy. "He's got a catapult." "Of course it's him." The boy looked round slyly and asked, "But where are you, lady?" "I'm not here," Margarita replied. "I'm in your dream." "That's what I thought," said the boy. "Now lie down," Margarita ordered. "Put your hand under your cheek, and you'll keep dreaming of me." "All right," the boy agreed, and immediately lay down with his hand under his cheek. "I'll tell you a story," Margarita began, placing her hot hand over his short hair. "Once upon a time, there lived a woman. She had no children, nor any happiness either, so she cried for a long time, and then she turned wicked." Margarita fell silent and removed her hand. The boy was asleep. Margarita put the hammer down quietly on the windowsill and flew out of the window. Mayhem reigned outside the building. People ran screaming around the asphalt pavement, littered with glass shards. Policemen were already appearing in their midst. Suddenly a bell rang, and a red fire engine with ladders rolled into the street from the Arbart. But the rest did not concern Margarita. Taking aim so as not to hit some wire, she grasped her broom tighter and instantly rose high above the ill-fated building. The street beneath her tilted sideways and dropped away. A host of roofs, interlaced with glittering paths of light, appeared beneath Margarita's feet in its place. Then it all began to slide away, and the chains of light blended and blurred. Margarita made another leap, and the entire host of roofs fell through the earth to be replaced by a lake of jittering electric lights. Suddenly the lake shot up and appeared over Margarita's head, while the moon twinkled under her feet. Realizing that she had flipped upside down, Margarita returned to an upright position. Turning round, she saw that the lake, too, was gone, and only a pink glow lingered far behind her on the horizon. A second later, it vanished, and Margarita found herself flying alone next to the moon, above and to her left. Margarita's hair stood on end in shock, and the moonlight whistled as it washed over her body. Seeing two broken rows of light beneath her merge into two unbroken fiery lines, seeing how quickly they disappeared behind her, Margarita guessed that she was travelling at tremendous speed, and marvelled at the fact that she had no trouble breathing. Several seconds later, a new lake of electric light lit up far below in the dark mass of land and rolled under the flyer's feet, only to launch into a corkscrew spin and fall back into the earth. A few seconds later, a repeat of the same. "Cities! Cities!" Margarita shouted. 2 or 3 times she saw bleak, reflective, sabre-like shapes lying in black sheaths below, and realised that they were rivers. Turning her head up and to the left, the flying woman admired the sight of the moon above her, racing madly back towards Moscow, and at the same time oddly managing to remain in one place. A mysterious, dark shape, clearly visible on its surface, a dragon perhaps, or a magical humpbacked horse, its sharp nose pointing towards the city she had abandoned. It occurred to Margarita that, come to think of it, she did not need to spur on her broom at such a desperate pace, and that she was depriving herself of the opportunity to get a better look at everything, to properly satiate herself with the experience of flight. Something told her that her destination would wait, that there was no need to grow bored at such crazy speeds and heights. Margarita tilted the bristled end of the broom down, raising its tail end, and lowering her speed greatly, headed down to earth. It was this downward glide, as though on an aerial sled, that gave her the most satisfaction. The earth rose towards her, and all the mysteries and charms of a moonlit night took form in the previously shapeless black mass. The earth was still approaching, and already Margarita was surrounded by the scent of greening forests. Margarita flew just above the fogs of a dewy meadow, and then over a pond. A chorus of frogs sang below, and the sound of a train somewhere in the distance put a strange quiver into her heart. Soon Margarita caught sight of it. It crawled along as slowly as a caterpillar, blowing sparks into the air. Passing it, Margarita flew over another watery mirror, a second moon floating in it beneath her feet. She descended even lower, the tops of the giant pines almost brushing her feet. The low noise of separating air came from behind and began to catch up with Margarita, the sound of some sort of flying projectile. It was gradually joined by a woman's laughter, audible over many miles. Margarita glanced behind her and saw a complex dark object chasing her. It became clearer as it approached, revealing a flying rider of some sort. Finally, it was perfectly visible. Slowing down, Natasha pulled alongside Margarita. Completely naked, her messy hair fluttering in the air, she was flying on a large hog. The hog was clutching a briefcase in his front hooves and hammering the air furiously with his hind legs. A pince-nez had fallen from the hog's nose and flew next to him, attached by a cord, glittering occasionally in the moonlight. The hog's hat kept slipping down over his eyes. Looking closer, Margarita recognized Nikolai Ivanovich, and her laughter thundered over the forest, joining Natasha's own. "Natashka!" Margarita screamed. "You used the cream!" "Darling!" Natasha replied, rousing the sleepy pine wood with her screaming. "My French queen! I smeared it on him too, right on his bald head." "My princess!" the hog bawled loudly, galloping under his rider. "Margarita Nikolaevna, darling!" Natasha cried, riding alongside Margarita. "I took the cream, I admit. We want to live and fly too, after all. Forgive me, my mistress, but I won't go back, not for anything. Oh, how good is this, Margarita Nikolaevna? He propositioned me, you know." Natasha thrust her finger at the embarrassed, panting hog. "Propositioned? What did you call me, huh?" she yelled, leaning towards the hog's ear. "Goddess!" howled the hog. "I cannot fly so fast. I may lose important papers.
Natalia Prokofievna, I must protest."
"To hell with your papers!" Natasha shouted, laughing impudently.
"Natalia Prokofievna, someone may hear us!"
the hog bellowed pleadingly. Flying next to Margarita, Natasha laughingly related what took place in the mansion after Margarita Nikolaevna flew over the gate. She admitted that without touching any of her presents, she threw off her clothes, ran to the cream, and rubbed it immediately on herself. The same thing that had happened to her mistress happened to her. While Natasha was laughing with joy and admiring her magical beauty in front of the mirror, the door opened, and a very agitated Nikolai Ivanovitch appeared before her. He was holding Margarita's shirt in his hands, as well as his own hat and briefcase. Seeing Natasha, Nikolai Ivanovitch was stupefied. Red as a lobster, he collected himself and announced that he felt obligated to pick up the shirt and personally deliver it. "Oh, the things he said, the scoundrel!" Natasha screamed, laughing. "The things he said! The things he tried to entice me to! The money he promised! Said that Claudia Petrovna would never find out! What? Am I lying?" Natasha yelled at the hog, and the latter could only turn away his snout in embarrassment. Natasha got carried away in the bedroom, smeared some cream on Nikolai Ivanovitch, and was amazed. The respectable tenant's face fused into a pig's snout, and his hands and feet turned to hooves. Glancing at himself in the mirror, Nikolai Ivanovitch let out a desperate and savage howl. But it was too late. Several seconds later, he was mounted and flown out of Moscow to hell knows where, wailing in anguish.
"I demand that my natural appearance be restored to me,"
the hog grunted hoarsely all of a sudden, half furious, half imploring.
"I have no intention of flying to an illegal gathering. Margarita Nikolaevna, you must rein in your housekeeper."
"Oh, so now I'm a housekeeper to you, a housekeeper!" Natasha cried, pinching the hog's ear. "And I used to be a goddess. What did you call me?"
"Venus,"
the hog replied tearfully, noisily brushing the hazel bushes with his little hooves as he flew over a stream rushing amid the rocks. "Venus! Venus!" Natasha cried victoriously, placing one hand on her hip and stretching out the other towards the moon. "Margarita, my queen! Ask them if I can stay a witch. They'll do anything for you. You've been granted power." And Margarita replied, "Very well, I promise." "Thank you," Natasha shouted, and suddenly cried out sharply, and somehow miserably, "Hey, hey, faster, faster, let's pick up the pace." She dug her heels into the hog's sides, which had already lost weight in the course of the insane ride, and he tore through the air, ripping it open. A moment later, Natasha was a black dot ahead on the horizon, and then she disappeared entirely, the sound of her flight scattering in the air. Margarita continued to fly slowly over deserted and unknown country, over hills dotted with occasional boulders amid enormous, sparsely growing pines. This was probably somewhere very far from Moscow, Margarita thought as she flew. The broom no longer passed over the treetops, but flew between the trunks, their sides silvered by the moon. The flyer's soft shadow glided on the ground ahead. The moon was now shining at Margarita's back. Margarita sensed she was approaching water and guessed that her goal was near. The pines parted, and Margarita glided quietly through the air towards a chalk cliff. A river lay below it in the shadows. The fog clung to the bushes on the vertical cliff, while the opposite bank lay flat and low. Beneath a solitary group of branchy trees on the other side, the flickering light of a bonfire revealed small moving figures. Margarita thought she heard a nagging, happy little tune. Beyond that, as far as the eye could see, there were no signs of people or life on the silvery plain. Margarita slid off the cliff and quickly reached the water below. The river beckoned her after her dash through the air. Throwing away the broom, she took a running start and dived headfirst into the water. Her light body pierced the river like an arrow, throwing up a column of water almost as high as the moon. The water turned out to be warm, like in a bathhouse. Emerging from the deep, Margarita took her fill of solitary nighttime swimming on the river. There was no one immediately near Margarita, but then splashing and snorting came from beyond the bushes nearby. Someone else was taking a swim. Margarita ran out onto the shore. Her body was glowing after her bath. She felt no fatigue and hopped around cheerfully on the moist grass. Suddenly, she stopped dancing and pricked up her ears. The snorting drew closer, and a fat man climbed out of some broom bushes, naked except for the silk-black top hat on the back of his head. His feet were covered in silty mud that made it look like he was wearing black boots. Judging by his huffs and hiccups, he was considerably drunk, a notion supported by the fact that the river suddenly began to smell of cognac. Seeing Margarita, the fat man peered at her, then bellowed joyously.
"What's this? Is it really her I see? Claudine, the merry widow? Is it you? You are here too?"
And he went to greet her. Margarita took a step back and replied with dignity,
"Go to hell, Claudine! What's who you're talking to?"
And after a moment's reflection, she added a long, unprintable obscenity to her words. All of this had quite a sobering effect on the frivolous fat man.
"Boy!"
he exclaimed quietly and shuddered.
"Kindly forgive me, dazzling Queen Margot. I made a mistake. It's all this accursed cognac's fault."
The fat man fell on one knee, held aside his top hat, and bowed. Then, mixing Russian and French, he began to babble some nonsense about his friend Guessard's bloody wedding in Paris, about the cognac, and about being mortified by his unfortunate mistake. "You ought to put some pants on, you son of a bitch," Margarita said, softening. Seeing that Margarita was not angry, the fat man grinned happily, and then informed her enthusiastically that he only lacked pants because he had absent-mindedly left them on the Yenisei River, where he had been swimming previously. Fortunately, as it happened to be nearby, he would fly there right away. Then, entrusting himself to her favour and patronage, he began to back away, and continued to do so until he slipped and fell backwards into the water. But even as he fell, a smile of ecstatic devotion remained on his sideburn-framed face. As for Margarita, she gave a piercing whistle, and, mounting her approaching broom, flew over the river to the opposite bank. The shadow of the chalk cliff did not reach here, and the entire bank was flooded in moonlight. As soon as Margarita touched down on the moist grass, the music under the willows grew louder, and the column of sparks flew up merrily from the bonfire. Under the willow branches, strewn with tender, fluffy catkins that glittered in the moonlight, sat 2 rows of fat-headed frogs. Inflating, as if made of rubber, they were playing a flashy march on wooden pipes. Glowing bits of wood hung on willow twigs in front of the musicians, lighting up their music sheets, and the restless light of the bonfire played on the snouts of the frogs. The march was in Margarita's honour. She received a most solemn reception. Transparent mermaids paused their round dance over the river and waved weeds at Margarita, their moaning greetings carrying far over the deserted green bank. Leaping from behind the willows, nude witches formed a line and began to curtsy and bow with the best of courtly manners. Some goat-legged fellow flew up to her and kissed her hand. Spreading out silk on the grass, he inquired as to whether the Queen had had a good swim, and invited her to lie down and rest. Margarita did just that. The goat-legged man brought her a glass of champagne, which she drank, warming her heart instantly. Inquiring as to the whereabouts of Natasha, she was told that Natasha had already bathed and departed for Moscow on her hog, to let everyone know of Margarita's impending arrival and assist in preparing her attire. Margarita's short stay beneath the willows was marked by one brief episode. Whistling through the air, a dark body plummeted into the water, evidently missing its target. In a few moments, the same fat man with sideburns, who had so ineptly introduced himself on the opposite bank, appeared before Margarita. He had apparently managed to hike over to the Yenisei, for he was in full formal attire, although wet from head to toe. The cognac had let him down again. He had landed in the water. Nonetheless, he kept his smile on this unfortunate occasion as well, and the laughing Margarita allowed him to kiss her hand. Everyone began to get ready. The mermaids finished their dance in the moonlight and dissolved in it. The goat-legged man inquired politely how Margarita had made it to the river. Discovering that she had ridden here on a broom, he said, "Why, that is so inconvenient." He instantly fashioned a dubious-looking telephone from 2 twigs and demanded that someone send a car this minute. His order was carried out, literally, right that minute. An open brown car came crashing down on the island, and it was no ordinary chauffeur in the driver's seat, but a black, long-beaked rook wearing an oilcloth cap and gauntlets. The island grew empty. The witches flew away, dissolving in the intense moonlight. The bonfire was burning out, and grey ash covered the embers. The man with sideburns and the goat-legged creature helped Margarita into the broad back seat. The car whined, jumped, and rose almost to the moon. The island vanished, the river vanished, and Margarita went racing off to Moscow.